Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Chromatographic, the show in which I, Matt the Game Boy, will take you through the highs and lows of the Game Boy Color library, one card at a time. Well, as it is the season, let's look at Santa Claus Junior. The late years of the Game Boy Color were truly the Wild West in terms of game publication. With the Game Boy Advance on the market, the games hitting store shelves for the system in late 2001 were generally based upon licenses. This is especially true in Europe, where the system saw its fair share of games based on extremely regional properties. One studio creating such games was German-based Neon Software, who, besides making the system's port of Dave Mirra BMX and Armory's Project Swarm, made games based on German licenses like Die Maus, Pumuckl and Janosch. After being purchased by Austrian publisher Jorwood, the decision was made to use Neon's Game Boy Color engine to produce a Christmas game to sell in European toy stores in the run-up to the holidays. Up until that point, the studio's engine had mainly been used in top-down games, but with a little tweaking, they were able to create the side-scrolling platformer that would become Santa Claus Junior. With a 6-month development cycle, the game saw a release on December 1st, 2001 in Europe exclusively. While the cynical among you might see this as a shameless cash grab, and to be honest, are probably right, as even the studio themselves saw Santa as an IP they didn't have to pay a licensing fee to use, would be wise not to write it off as just another Christmas game, because, well, it gets a little weird. Right from the off, the game's story isn't all that conventional. A wicked witch captures Santa, so with the aid of a fairy and Santa's signature red jacket, it's up to a little boy called Nick to gather the gifts that fell off Santa's sleigh, rescue him from the witch's clutches, and save Christmas. As a side-scrolling platform, the gameplay is very simplistic. You navigate over 20 levels, collecting Christmas-themed pickups and jumping on the heads of enemies as you march your way towards the exit and on to the next level. While the collectibles are all Christmas-themed, picking up 25 candy canes will net you an extra life, and the gifts simply add to a total racked up at the end of the game, the enemies really aren't. Sure, there are animals that feel Christmassy, like squirrels and hedgehogs. Some are spooky, like cats and ghosts. But the closer you get to fighting the end boss, the more the enemies become really strange. I'm talking eyeballs on legs and fork-headed humanoids weird. It really made me think that this game hadn't always intended to be a Christmas game, but after talking with some folks who worked on it, they simply put this strangeness down to their designers finally being able to free themselves from the shackle of kids' IPs. This manifests itself in the level design too, as near the end of the game, gone too are the snowy rooftops and cathedral bells that filled the backgrounds of the earlier stages, making way for crumbling castles and eventually nightmarish organic backgrounds dotted with animated eyes. This makes some sense when you consider that the team was inspired by The Nightmare Before Christmas, but the game really has a European vibe to it. And I don't mean that in the pejorative either. There's both a sense of foreboding in the artwork that's present in a lot of European folklore, but there's also something that reminds me of early 90s Amiga titles, thanks to the colour palette and organic-looking tile set. This interesting artwork is somewhat of a double-edged sword, however. As is often the case with Game Boy Color titles, the breakdown of foreground and background can get a little blurry. This isn't helped by the fact that some pillars and tree trunks can be walked past while other times they act as walls. Some of the more labyrinthian levels provide arrows to try and circumvent this issue, but even then it's not always clear as to what's a platform and what isn't. Mechanically, the game's jump also feels a little bit floaty to begin with, but honestly, I got used to it pretty quickly as I progressed through the game's levels. What annoyed me more though, was the most damage dealt by the game's enemies usually comes with a knockback, making me lose more than a few lives to poorly timed leaps. It might sound like a minor annoyance, but trust me, losing a life in this game is incredibly punishing because the game offers the player no continues. Yes folks, running out of lives here is game over. To make it worse, your lives, health bar and pickup total are all tied into the password you get at the end of each stage, meaning there are scenarios where you die, enter a password and restart the level with only a slither of health. It's very, very frustrating and probably one of the biggest marks against the game for me personally. If you can get past this however, I think it's fair to say that a good time can be had with Santa Claus Junior if you're looking for some festive fun. The artwork is certainly interesting even if it won't be to everyone's taste, but I have to be honest and say the rest of the game is pretty average. There are some merits in the soundtrack too, with the highlights being some of the soundtrack is 8-bit Eurodance-inspired takes on Christmas classics, but if that isn't your cup of tea, you can always turn it off at the options screen or by pressing pause at any time. Overall, I'm not going to go so far as to say this is a hidden gem. The lack of continues, floaty jumps, and the less than clear level design on some stages sees to that, but I wouldn't say it's a bad game. So, if you like your Christmas tales a little darker than Disney and don't mind a bit of a challenge, maybe slip Santa Claus Junior into the Game Boy Color this Christmas. And that brings us to the end of another Chromatographic, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have enjoyed. First of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Falco Loeffler and Dennis Ranke for answering some questions I had about this game. And if you've liked it, please share it around and spread the Christmas spirit. Until next week though, Game Boys and Girls, we'll be back with another Game Boy classic. Merry Christmas and game on.